There is a kind of silence that only exists right after you realize something is gone. Not the silence of a quiet room or a peaceful morning. A different kind. The kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to draw a full breath. The kind that sounds like a door closing on everything you have ever worked for. Maya Collins heard that silence on a Thursday morning in October, standing outside the American Embassy in a torn sleeve and dusty shoes, her heart still racing from a run she had not planned to take, her hands still shaking from a fear that was not even hers to carry. She had been on time. She had planned for everything. She had prepared for 18 months for this one appointment, this one morning, this one door that stood between her and every single dream she had ever allowed herself to believe in. And then a child nearly died, and Maya made a choice. Not slowly, not after careful calculation, not after weighing what she had to lose against what the child had to lose. She made it in the space between one breath and the next, the way people who are built from a certain kind of goodness always do, without asking whether the world will be fair to them afterward. The world was not fair to Maya. Not that morning, not in the hours that followed, and not when she walked back through her front door and discovered that while she was saving a life, someone in her own home had been very, very busy destroying hers. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments right now where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story, every single chapter of it, is one you are going to want to stay for until the very last word. To understand what happened to Maya Collins, you have to understand that this is not simply a story about a visa interview. It is not simply a story about a cruel stepmother or a stolen opportunity, though both of those things are very much a part of it. This is a story about what happens when a woman with nothing left to give keeps giving anyway, and what the universe eventually does with that kind of person. It is a story about a family held together by the appearance of love and hollowed out by the reality of greed. It is a story about a little girl who survived a terrible accident and grew up remembering the woman who pulled her from it. And it is a story about a man named Richard Calloway, who built one of the largest private healthcare investment firms in the entire country, who had more resources than most governments, and who spent 5 quiet, methodical, deliberate years moving in the direction of a young woman he had never met but owed everything to. Ask yourself this before we go any further. If you had spent 2 years building toward one appointment, one morning, one chance that could not be rescheduled or replaced, and a stranger needed you 30 minutes before you were supposed to walk through those doors, what would you do? Be honest with yourself. Because most people, if they are truly honest, would feel the pull in 2 directions and choose themselves. Maya did not choose herself, and Diane Mercer, the woman who called herself Maya's stepmother, watched her leave that morning and decided to turn Maya's sacrifice into her own daughter's reward. 3 questions are going to drive this entire story. How far did Diane actually go? What did Richard Calloway discover 5 years later? And what does justice look like when it finally arrives for a woman who was told she had no right to expect it? Maya Collins was born in Columbus, Ohio, on a February morning to a woman named Patricia Collins, who worked as a certified nursing assistant for 16 years and believed with everything in her that caring for other people was the most honorable work a human being could do. Patricia was the kind of woman who remembered the names of every patient she had ever treated, who brought her own coffee from home so she could use her break money to buy sandwiches for the overnight cleaning crew, and who came home after 12-hour shifts still asking her daughter how her day had gone before she ever sat down to rest. Maya grew up watching her mother pour herself out daily into other people's survival. And she grew up wanting to be exactly that woman. Not a version of her. Not an imitation. Exactly her. Patricia Collins died of a cardiac event when Maya was 11 years old. There was no warning, no slow decline, no time to prepare. One morning she was there, and by afternoon she was not. Maya's father, Gerald Collins, was a logistics supervisor who worked long hours and loved his daughter but had never been taught how to sit inside grief without trying to replace what caused it. He lasted 3 years as a single father before he met Diane Mercer at a church event, and by the following spring, Diane had moved into the Collins house with her 2 daughters, Cara and Jess, and a smile that the neighbors described as warm and that Maya, even at 14, recognized as something performed rather than felt. Diane Mercer had a particular talent that people like her always develop over time. She knew how to be kind when being kind cost her nothing, and how to be cruel in ways that were difficult to name out loud, because none of them were large enough on their own to hold up as evidence. It was the way she described Patricia as Gerald's first chapter in a tone that made the word feel like something that belonged in a story that had since improved. It was the way Kara's school supplies were purchased without a second thought, while Maya's nursing reference books were described as things the family had not budgeted for this month. It was the way she praised Kara's mediocre grades in the same breath she questioned Maya's exceptional ones, suggesting that Maya must have had help, or that she was spending too much time studying to be useful around the house. There was never one large thing you could point to. There was only the slow, steady accumulation of 1,000 small ones, until the weight of them became something Maya carried in her spine every single day. Gerald Collins did not see it. Or perhaps he saw it and chose to call it something else, because acknowledging it would have required him to choose between the peace of his home and the welfare of his daughter. He loved Maya. That was never in question. But he loved her the way exhausted people love difficult things at a distance, with the quiet hope that if he stayed still enough, things would find their own level. They did not find their own level. They found Diane's level. And Diane's level left Maya eating alone more often than not, contributing to household expenses before she was old enough to legally hold a full-time job, and learning very early that in this house she was tolerated as a presence but resented as a reminder of the life that had existed before Diane arrived. Maya was 16 years old when she began building her exit plan, and she built it the way her mother had taught her to build everything, carefully, without announcing it, one honest step at a time. She studied with the focused intensity of someone who understood that academic excellence was not just ambition in her situation, it was armor. She volunteered at a free clinic on Saturday mornings, where she learned how to take blood pressure readings, how to assist with wound dressings, and how to speak to patients who were frightened in a way that made them feel less alone. She saved money from a part-time job at a pharmacy, money she deposited into an account she had opened in her own name at a bank 3 miles from the house, because she had already learned at 16 that anything left within Diane's reach had a way of disappearing. By the time Maya was 24, she had a scholarship offer from a nursing degree program affiliated with a university partnership network. 60% tuition coverage, conditional on visa approval and enrollment confirmation. She had applied 3 times to earn it. The first application was waitlisted. The second was rejected with a request for a stronger clinical portfolio. She spent an entire year building that portfolio, volunteering more hours, documenting more patient care cases, and asking a supervising doctor at the clinic to write her a recommendation letter that reflected not just her technical skills, but the kind of person she was when no one was watching. The third application was accepted. Maya did not celebrate loudly. She sat in her car outside the pharmacy that evening and cried quietly for 10 minutes, then wiped her face and drove home and did not tell Diane. She told her father Gerald, who hugged her and said he was proud, and she believed him in the way she always believed the genuine things Gerald said while knowing he would not fight to protect them. And she told her 8-year-old sister Kira, her father and Patricia's younger biological daughter, who was the one pure and uncomplicated love in Maya's daily life. Kira was the kind of child who collected facts the way other children collected toys, who announced things like, "Did you know the human heart beats around 100,000 times a day?" and then went immediately back to whatever she was drawing without waiting for a response. When Maya told Kira about the scholarship and the visa, Kira put down her crayon, looked up with her serious brown eyes, and said, "You are going to be the best nurse in the whole country." Maya laughed and said, "The whole country is a lot of nurses, Kiki." Kira picked up her crayon and said, "I know. You will still be the best." Maya carried that sentence in her chest like a held breath all the way to the morning of the interview. The visa application process was 18 months long and involved 3 separate form submissions, 2 administrative delays, 1 request for resubmitted financial documentation, and a level of bureaucratic patience that would have broken someone who had not already spent years surviving inside Diane Mercer's household. Maya navigated all of it without shortcuts, without connections, and without missing a single deadline. When the final interview date arrived, a Thursday in October, 9 o'clock in the morning at the American Embassy, Maya had her documents organized in the exact sequence the embassy website recommended. She had written down the address, the transit route, and a backup route in case something went wrong. She had set 3 separate alarms. She had laid out her outfit the night before. She had given herself 2 full hours of travel time for a 45-minute journey. Maya Collins did not leave things to chance. She had spent her entire life making sure of that. The night before the interview, something happened that Maya would turn over in her mind many times in the years that followed. She was in her room arranging her documents for the third time when Diane appeared in the doorway. She did not come in. She simply stood there watching Maya organize the folder, and then she said, "Get some rest, big day tomorrow," in a voice that Maya described to her closest friend as almost too gentle. Not warm, not genuine, just measured. Like a woman who was saying the right words while thinking about something else entirely. Maya told her friend she was probably overthinking it. She was not overthinking it. Because what Maya did not know as she turned off her light that night and tried to sleep was that Diane had already been watching the visa application process for weeks. She had already noted the interview date, the time, the location, and the fact that the appointment was non-reschedulable. She had already done her research on what happened to embassy appointment slots when an applicant failed to appear, and she had already identified someone with enough knowledge of the administrative process to help her move quickly if the right window opened. Diane Mercer did not improvise. She prepared, and on the morning of Maya's interview, she was ready. Maya left the house at 6:53 in the morning. She was 32 minutes ahead of her already generous schedule. The folder was in her hand. Her documents were in order. Her backup route was memorized. She walked to the transit stop with the quiet focus of someone who had been waiting for this morning for 2 years, and she allowed herself, just for those few minutes on the walk, to imagine what it would feel like to walk out of the embassy with an approval stamp, to call Kira and tell her, to sit in her car and cry the good kind of tears for once. She was somewhere in the middle of that thought when her phone rang. The number was not saved in her contacts. She almost did not answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was young, female, and barely holding itself together. Her name was Sophie. She was 18 years old, and she was alone on a street 6 blocks from the embassy, having collapsed against a wall after what she described between gasps as her heart doing something wrong. She said she had found Maya's number in her phone because Maya had once helped her with a medical form at the free clinic nearly a year earlier, a brief interaction Maya only vaguely remembered. Sophie said she had called 2 other people before Maya, and neither had answered. Her voice was thin and frightened and very young. Maya heard it and felt the thing she had spent her entire life learning to feel, the pull towards someone who needed help, the instinct her mother had built into her one example at a time across 11 years of watching. She looked at the time on her phone. It was 7:14. The embassy was 6 blocks away. Sophie was 4 blocks in the opposite direction. Maya stood on the sidewalk for exactly 11 seconds. Then she turned around. She found Sophie sitting against a brick wall outside a dry cleaner, her breathing shallow and uneven, her color wrong in the way that people with cardiac irregularities sometimes go wrong when their body starts compensating for something it cannot fix on its own. Maya knelt beside her and did what she had been trained to do. She checked Sophie's pulse. She spoke to her calmly and steadily. She kept her still. She called emergency services. And then she stayed with her hands on Sophie's wrist counting heartbeats until the ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. She helped the paramedics transfer Sophie onto the stretcher. She gave them the information she had gathered in those 7 minutes. One of the paramedics looked at her and asked if she was a nurse. Maya said not yet. He nodded slowly like he thought that was only a matter of time. When the ambulance doors closed and Sophie was safely inside, Maya looked down at her folder and then at the time on her phone. It was 7:41. The embassy was 6 blocks away. Her appointment was at 9. She ran. She ran until her shoes raised dust, and her sleeve caught on a metal corner of a vendor's cart and tore at the shoulder, and she did not stop for it. She ran until her lungs told her to stop, and she told her lungs to wait. She arrived at the embassy gate at 8:59, 1 minute before her appointment time, sweating and breathing hard and holding her folder with both hands. The officer at the gate looked at her torn sleeve and her dusty shoes and her flushed face, and he told her that her name had already been called twice in the waiting area, and that the protocol for the morning session was that applicants who were not seated and processed by 8:55 were recorded as no-shows and their slots were closed. Maya said please. She said there was a medical emergency, a young woman who collapsed. She had the emergency services call log on her phone right there. The officer said he was sorry. He said to contact the embassy to reschedule. And the gate slid back into place with a sound that was not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of sound that deserves to mark the moment a person's future is taken from them. But it did. One quiet metallic sound. And everything Maya had spent 2 years building was on the other side of it. She stood outside that gate for 4 minutes before she moved. Later, she would not be able to tell anyone exactly what she thought during those 4 minutes. She remembered looking at the folder in her hands. She remembered thinking about Kira's face. She remembered her mother's voice from somewhere old and quiet inside her, saying you did right. She did not feel comforted by it in that moment. She walked back to the transit stop and rode home in silence, sitting with her torn sleeve and her empty future and the particular exhaustion of a person who has done everything correctly and been handed the wrong result anyway. When Maya walked through the front door of the Collins house at 10:23 that morning, Diane was sitting in the living room. Not reading, not watching television. Sitting, like someone who had been waiting. Maya noticed it and told herself she was being paranoid. She set her folder on the hall table and began to say that something had happened, that she had been at the embassy but missed the window, that she needed to explain. Diane looked at her and said, "You missed it then." Not a question. A statement delivered with the flatness of someone who already knew the answer before the door opened. Maya stopped. She said, "How did you know I missed it?" Diane did not answer immediately. She picked up her coffee cup and took a sip and looked at Maya over the rim with the expression of a woman who had already finished a task and was enjoying the quiet that followed. That was when Maya saw it. The drawer beneath the television stand, the one with the small brass lock where she kept her passport copy, her embassy confirmation letter, the invitation letter from the nursing program, her sponsor documentation, her medical clearance forms, and every supporting document she had spent 18 months collecting. That drawer was open. Not fully open, just slightly, the way a drawer looks when someone has been through it carefully and closed it almost all the way, but not quite, because they were not expecting the person who owned it to be home so soon. Maya walked to it. Her hands were shaking before she touched the handle. She opened it fully. It was empty. She turned to Diane. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She said, "Where are my documents?" Diane set down her coffee cup and stood slowly, the way people stand when they are not afraid of you and they want you to know it. She said, "A girl who cannot arrive on time to her own interview does not deserve such an opportunity." Maya turned toward the hallway, and Kara was standing there. Kara Mercer, Diane's 22-year-old biological daughter, who had applied twice for a visa to the same nursing program and been denied twice because her academic record and clinical documentation did not meet the requirements. Kara was wearing Maya's good shoes, the ones Maya had bought with 3 weeks of pharmacy salary specifically for the interview. She was wearing them in the house in the middle of the morning the way you wear something that already belongs to you. Maya looked at the shoes and then at Kara's face, and Kara met her eyes without blinking and said, "I did what made sense." She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, evenly and without apology, because they have already decided the other person's feelings are not a relevant part of the outcome. What Diane had done, what Maya came to understand fully over the hours that followed through the fragments Diane let slip with the particular cruelty of someone who wanted credit for their own work, was this. Diane had known for weeks that embassy appointment slots could be redirected through the administrative system within a narrow window after a no-show was recorded, if you knew the right process and had the right paperwork already in hand. She had used the documents from Maya's drawer, specifically the invitation letter from the nursing program and the sponsor documentation, to present Kara as a substitute applicant through a process that involved altering certain identifying details with the help of someone inside a travel agency who had performed this kind of service before. It was not clean. It was not legal, but it was fast. And by the time Maya was standing outside the embassy gate at 8:59, Kara was already seated inside the waiting area in Maya's good shoes with Maya's paperwork in an altered folder, waiting for her name to be called. At 11:40 that morning, while Maya was riding the transit home in silence, Kara walked out of the American embassy with a visa approval stamp, in a passport with her name on it, carrying a future that had been built entirely by someone else. Maya sat on the edge of her bed that afternoon and looked at the empty drawer for a long time. She heard Kara in the next room pulling a suitcase from the closet. She heard Diane on the phone telling someone that Kara had done wonderfully, that the girl was born for this, that opportunity always finds the deserving. Maya sat very still, and listened to all of it without moving. She thought about Sophie on the sidewalk. She thought about the paramedic who had looked at her like she belonged in medicine. She thought about her mother, who had poured herself out daily into other people's survival and died before she got to see what it had produced in her daughter. She thought about Kira, 8 years old and sleeping down the hall, who had told her she would be the best nurse in the whole country. And she thought about the fact that the documents in that empty drawer had represented not just a visa, but the only inheritance her mother had ever been able to leave her. The inheritance of having raised a daughter disciplined enough to earn something like that. Diane had stolen it. Not just the papers. The inheritance. The scholarship offer was rescinded after she missed the appointment without approved documentation of a sustained emergency. Her appeal was denied because the emergency services record showed she had been present with Sophie for 9 minutes before the ambulance arrived, and the embassy's standard required evidence of an unavoidable emergency lasting beyond the interview window. 9 minutes. That was the margin by which the appeal failed. 9 minutes during which she had counted a stranger's heartbeats and told her she was going to be all right. The nursing program could not hold her place beyond the enrollment deadline. She understood. She thanked them for the 3 years of applications they had reviewed and ended the call and sat in her car for 40 minutes and then went inside and made dinner because it was her night to cook and Kira would be hungry after school. She stayed in the Collins house for 4 more months because leaving required money she did not yet have enough of, and because Kira was there, and leaving Kira felt like abandoning the last piece of her mother she had access to. During those 4 months, Diane's behavior did not soften after getting what she wanted. It sharpened, the way certain people sharpen once they understand they can act without consequence. Diane began referring to Maya's visa situation to guests as a cautionary tale about a girl who had too many distractions. She had printed one of Kara's photographs from abroad and framed it on the living room wall, and when visitors admired it, she would say that was what happened when a young woman stayed focused. Maya was present for 3 separate occasions on which Diane said this. She said nothing each time. Silence was the only thing in that house that still belonged entirely to her. On a Tuesday morning in late February, while Diane and Gerald were both at work and Kira was at school, Maya packed one bag. She took her personal documents, her savings, her mother's small jewelry box, a photograph of Patricia, and Kira's drawing of the 2 of them that had been taped to her mirror since the girl was 6 years old. She left a note for Gerald that said she was safe and would be in touch, and that she loved him and that she hoped he would one day understand. She left nothing for Diane. She walked out of the Collins house before noon, and she did not look back at it. Not because looking back would have been wrong, but because she had learned from her mother that the way forward required your full attention, and she could not afford to give any part of it to a house that had spent 8 years trying to convince her she was worth less than she was. She rented a room in a shared apartment on the Near East Side of Columbus. 2 roommates, a small kitchen, a bathroom she shared, and a window that faced a brick wall. It was the cleanest and most peaceful space she had lived in since she was 14 years old. She went back to the pharmacy, took extra shifts, and within 6 months had enough saved to rent a small 1-bedroom apartment closer to the community health center where she now worked part-time as a medical administrative assistant. She enrolled in an online prerequisite program for nursing licensure, studying on her lunch breaks and after shifts, and on weekend mornings before the rest of the building was awake. She visited Kira every other Saturday, picking her up from the Collins house and taking her to the library or the park or a diner where Kira could order pancakes and talk without stopping about whatever she was currently fascinated by. These Saturdays were the architecture of Maya's life during those years. Everything else was construction material. The Saturdays were the foundation. What Maya did not know during any of this was that her name had been spoken inside a very different kind of home. Sophie Calloway had recovered fully from the cardiac episode. She was treated, monitored, diagnosed with a structural irregularity that was entirely manageable with medication and sent home with a care plan. Her father, Richard Calloway, had been notified within 30 minutes of the ambulance call and had arrived at the hospital before Sophie was settled into a bed. Richard Calloway was not a man accustomed to arriving anywhere after something had already happened. He built his entire career on anticipation, on being several steps ahead of every situation, on the understanding that in business, as in emergencies, speed and information were the same currency. He arrived at the hospital and he was told that his daughter had been found on the street by a woman who had stayed with her, monitored her vital signs with what the paramedics described as clear clinical training, and remained until the ambulance came. The paramedic told him she said she was not yet a nurse, but she should be. Richard asked for the woman's name. The paramedic checked his report and said all he had was what she gave him before she left. Maya. No last name. No address. No contact information. Just Maya. Richard asked the hospital. He asked the emergency services dispatch. He asked Sophie, who in the haze of the first day could only say that the woman had kind eyes and had counted her breaths out loud to calm her down and had held her wrist with 2 fingers very specifically the way medical people held wrists. Sophie said the woman had told her she was going to be okay, and Sophie said she had believed her completely and immediately. Richard Calloway began a quiet search that he did not announce and did not assign to a large team because he did not want it to become something performative. He gave the task to one trusted researcher on his foundation staff and asked him to find a woman named Maya who had been near the embassy district on a Thursday morning in October and had medical training and had helped a young woman in cardiac distress. The researcher came back 3 weeks later with 17 possibilities and not enough additional information to narrow them further. Richard said, "Take the time." The search continued for 2 months before it stalled. Too many variables. Too few records. A medical encounter that had not been formally documented because Maya had left the scene before a named witness statement was filed. Richard kept the open file on his desk and reviewed it every few weeks. He did not close it. He did not forget. People who carry a debt, like the one Richard Calloway carried, do not forget. They simply wait for the missing piece to arrive. That piece arrived 5 years later on a Wednesday afternoon in September. Maya was walking from the community health center to her car after a long shift when she turned a corner and heard a sound that her body recognized before her mind fully processed it. A short, sharp cry that was not loud enough to bring anyone else running, but that Maya caught with the part of her that was always listening for exactly that kind of sound. The car at the curb was a black SUV, pulled to a stop at an angle, the door still open, and the young woman inside it had stepped awkwardly onto a broken piece of curb and fallen sideways against the door frame and hit the skin above her eyebrow on the corner of the window. Not a serious injury, but she was pale and her breathing was uneven and her driver was crouched beside the car looking between her and his phone with the specific panic of someone who has no idea what to do first. Maya reached the car in 15 seconds and she had already assessed the injury and begun speaking to the young woman in the calm, even voice before the driver had even finished explaining what had happened. She pressed a clean cloth against the cut above the eyebrow. She told the young woman to look at her. She told her the cut was small. She said, "Breathe with me." The young woman looked at Maya, and what happened in her eyes in the next several seconds was something Maya would remember for the rest of her life. First came the focusing, the return to the present that happens when a calm voice finds a frightened person and leads them back. And then came something else, something slower and deeper. The young woman looked at Maya's hands on her face. She listened to Maya's voice. She felt the 2 fingers on her wrist counting her pulse. And something moved across her face from somewhere old, some memory of a sidewalk and a brick wall, and a woman saying these same words in this same voice on a morning 5 years ago that she had never been able to fully let go of. She said, "Your name." Not a question, a statement. She looked at Maya, and she said, "Your name is Maya." Maya said yes. The young woman said, "You told me to breathe 5 years ago on a street near the embassy." Maya said yes. The young woman said, "You stayed with me until the ambulance came." Maya said yes. And Sophie Calloway, who was 23 years old now and 5 years further from the morning Maya had knelt beside her on a sidewalk, began to cry with the overwhelming relief of someone who has been looking for a thing for a long time and found it in the last place they expected on an ordinary afternoon. She took Maya's hand with both of hers and held it, and said, "My father has been looking for you for 5 years." Richard Calloway arrived at the hospital where Maya had accompanied Sophie for the standard precautionary evaluation in under 40 minutes. Maya was in the waiting area when he walked in. He crossed the room directly to her, and he stood in front of her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Are you Maya?" She said yes. He said, "You saved my daughter 5 years ago." She said, "I stayed with her until help came." He said quietly that those were the same thing. He looked at her in a way that Maya would later describe to Kira as the way someone looks at you when they have been carrying your name as an unfinished obligation for years and are finally, carefully, setting it down. He asked her to sit with him, and she sat. He asked her what had happened on that morning 5 years ago from the beginning, and Maya told him. She told him about the phone call and the 11 seconds on the sidewalk and the 4 blocks in the wrong direction and the 9 minutes, and the embassy gate, and the officer who had said interview time has passed. She told him about Diane. She told him about the empty drawer and Kara's shoes and the scholarship rescission and the 4 months before she left the Collins house and the years of rebuilding that followed. She told it carefully and without self-pity, the way she told difficult things, with the clarity of a woman who had processed the pain of it and was now simply giving him the facts. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to help you." Maya said, "You do not owe me anything." He said, "I know." He said that was not why he was offering. What Richard Calloway did over the following weeks was not loud or public or designed for cameras. He was not that kind of man, and he understood within the first 30 minutes of knowing Maya Collins that she was not that kind of woman either. He asked his foundation's legal team to examine what had happened with the visa. This was not complicated to reconstruct because the travel agency Diane had used had been investigated 2 years earlier for a separate document fraud case, and the records from that investigation included transaction logs that connected directly to the Mercer name and to a specific date and embassy reference number that matched Maya's original appointment precisely. The picture that emerged was not subtle. It was documented fraud. The use of altered identification documentation, the unauthorized transfer of application materials, the submission of a fraudulent sponsored application. Every element of what Diane had done was criminal. It had simply never been investigated because no one had looked and Maya had not had the resources to make anyone look. The second thing Richard did was contact the nursing program directly. He did not call in a favor. He presented the documented timeline of events, the embassy records, the emergency services report from the morning of the original appointment, the legal findings regarding the fraudulent transfer, and a letter from his foundation's healthcare education division. The program director reviewed the materials and called Maya within 72 hours. On that call, Maya was offered full reinstatement of her admission with a revised start date, full scholarship coverage, visa sponsorship through the Calloway Foundation's International Education Program, and a paid clinical residency at one of Richard Calloway's hospital network affiliates during her training. Maya said nothing for a long moment after the director finished speaking. The director asked if she was still on the line. Maya said yes. She said, "I have been working toward this for 7 years. The director said, "We know." She said, "The file on you is one of the most complete and consistent they had ever reviewed." While all of this was moving forward for Maya, something else was moving in a different direction on the other side of Columbus. The legal inquiry Richard's team had opened did not stay contained to the visa fraud. Document fraud investigations rarely do, because the kind of person who commits one form of it rarely commits only one. Diane Mercer, as it turned out, had not simply stolen a visa appointment. She had been systematically using her position in the Collins household to access financial instruments that did not belong to her. There were credit accounts opened in Gerald's name without his full knowledge, a refinanced home equity loan taken against the house to fund expenses Diane had described to Gerald as household necessities, and a series of small irregular transfers from a joint account to a separate account held only in Diane's name that had been occurring for the better part of 4 years. Small enough individually not to trigger automatic flags. Consistent enough that when a forensic accountant looked at them together, the pattern was immediately and unmistakably clear. Gerald Collins was presented with this information in a meeting that Richard Calloway attended personally. Gerald was shown the documents and the account statements and the timeline, and he sat in that meeting room and looked at the papers in the way a man looks at something that requires him to dismantle the story he has been telling himself for 8 years and rebuild it from the beginning with different materials. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he asked if Maya knew all of this. Richard said Maya knows about the visa. The rest we found afterward. Gerald asked where Maya was. Richard told him. Gerald asked if he could see her. Richard said that would be entirely Maya's decision to make. Maya agreed to see her father. They met at a coffee shop near the community health center, neutral ground that Maya chose herself. Gerald arrived before her and was sitting at a corner table when she walked in. She sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment with the weight of people who love each other and have caused each other pain and have not yet found the words that do justice to both of those things at once. Gerald said, "I am sorry." He said it simply, without conditions attached, which was the only form of that apology Maya would have accepted. He said, "I knew something was wrong, and I chose peace over you, and I should not have done that." Maya looked at her father's face and saw that he had aged in the years since she left, not just in the way that years age people physically, but in the deeper way that truth ages people when they finally stop running from it. She said, "I know you love me." He said, "I should have shown you better." There was not much else that needed to be said between them that afternoon, but what was said was enough to begin something. The legal proceedings against Diane Mercer moved with the efficiency that legal cases have when they are well documented and well resourced, and being driven by a man who understood that delayed justice was simply injustice dressed in patience. Diane was charged with document fraud, identity misrepresentation in a federal immigration process, and financial exploitation. The charges related to the visa were the most straightforward because the paper trail from the travel agency records was essentially complete. Kara was implicated as a knowing participant, which complicated her immigration status and required her to return from the United States while her case was under review. Kara came home to a house that was no longer the same house she had left. Gerald had initiated a legal separation from Diane shortly after the meeting with Richard's team. The framed photograph of Kara from abroad was no longer on the living room wall. The balloons and the store-bought cake and the celebrating felt, in retrospect, like a party built on borrowed ground, which was exactly what it had been. The day Kara received official notification that her visa status was suspended pending the fraud investigation, she sat in her childhood bedroom and looked at the walls for a long time. She had gone to America wearing someone else's opportunity and had spent 3 years building a life on a foundation with Maya Collins's name in the cement. And now the whole structure was coming apart, and she was sitting in the rubble of it trying to understand how the ground had given way so completely when she had felt so certain it was solid. She had been certain it was solid because her mother had told her it was. And her mother had been wrong, not just about the law, but about the deeper thing, the thing that neither of them had understood until it was too late. You cannot build a lasting life on something you took from someone who earned it. The structure will hold for a while, long enough to convince you it is yours, and then one day it will not. Maya was in her 3rd month of the nursing program when the case concluded. She was sitting in a clinical skills lab practicing for insertion technique when her phone buzzed with a message from Richard Calloway's legal team. She read it once. She put the phone face down on the table. She finished the practice repetition correctly before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and let the feeling arrive. It was not triumph in the loud sense. It was not the hot vindication she might have imagined in the early months after the empty drawer and the borrowed shoes and the rescinded scholarship. It was something quieter and in many ways more complete than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door that had been closed against her for 5 years finally opening, not because she had thrown herself against it, but because the truth had done what truth does when it is given enough time and enough light. It had made itself undeniable. She called Kira that evening. Kira was 13 now, still collecting facts, still the most direct person Maya had ever known, still capable of cutting straight to the center of any situation with the precision of someone who had never learned to be dishonest about what she saw. Maya told her about the case conclusion and the program and the residency starting in the spring. Kira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew it would work out." Maya said, "How did you know?" Kira said, "Because you kept going." She said, "People who keep going always eventually get somewhere." Maya said, "That is not always true, Kiki." Kira said, "Well, it was true for you." Maya could not argue with that. She did not try. She completed the nursing program with the highest clinical evaluation scores in her cohort. Her supervising physician wrote in her final assessment that Maya Collins demonstrated a quality of patient presence that could not be taught in a classroom, a quality that came from having learned at an early age that the person in front of you matters more than your own comfort. Maya read that assessment and thought about her mother taking the transit home after 12-hour shifts and still asking how the day had gone before sitting down to rest. She thought about the pharmacy savings account and the empty drawer and the 11 seconds on the sidewalk. She thought about all the versions of that morning that could have existed if she had been a different kind of person, a person who kept walking. She was glad she had not been that person. Not because it had worked out, because for a long time it had not worked out at all, but because the person she would have had to become in order to keep walking that morning was not a person she could have lived inside. Her mother had built her too well for that. She graduated on a Saturday in May. Gerald Collins was in the audience. Kira sat beside him wearing a blue dress she had picked herself, and she held a handmade sign she had made the night before that said, "I told you so," in large green letters with a small drawing of a nurse beside them. When Maya's name was called and she crossed the stage, Kira stood up and said her name so clearly and so joyfully that 3 rows of people turned to look and smiled, because there was nothing in that voice except pure and uncomplicated pride, the kind that belongs only to people who have watched someone they love earn something the hard way and waited for years to see them receive it. Richard Calloway was not in the audience. He had been invited and had declined with a handwritten note that said, "This day belongs entirely to you, and I would not want to share the credit for it." Maya read that note twice and felt a deep gratitude for a man who understood without being told that the greatest gift he could give her was to let her walk across that stage as herself. Not as someone he had rescued, not as a story attached to his name, as Maya Collins, who had turned around on a sidewalk when she could have kept walking, who had paid for it and rebuilt from it and arrived here on her own terms. She took a job at a community hospital on the east side of Columbus, not far from the neighborhood where she had grown up watching her mother leave for work in the dark. She chose it deliberately. She could have taken a position at one of the larger facilities affiliated with Richard Calloway's network, positions that paid more and offered more prestige. She visited both, and they were excellent. She chose the community hospital anyway because the patients who came through its doors were the patients who most needed the kind of nurse who remembered their names and asked how their day was going and held their wrists with 2 fingers the way Maya had learned to hold them, with the specific attention of someone who understood that a pulse was not just a number. It was a person. Those were her patients. They had always been her patients. Her mother had shown her that before she was old enough to understand what she was being shown. She sees Kira every Saturday still. Kira is in high school now, planning for a mathematics degree, still correcting people's arithmetic when they get it wrong in public, still the most honest person in any room she walks into. She comes to the hospital sometimes and sits in the break room asking Maya's colleagues detailed questions about their cases until someone realizes she is a teenager and not a medical student and reacts with appropriate surprise. Sophie Calloway sends Maya a message every year on the anniversary of the morning they met on a sidewalk near the embassy. The messages are never long. They say some version of the same thing. "Thank you for turning around." Maya always writes back. She always says the same thing in return. "Thank you for calling." Gerald Collins and Maya have dinner together on the first Sunday of every month. It took them a while to find the rhythm of it, the way people who have hurt each other and been honest about it take time to find the rhythm of the thing that comes after the honesty. But they found it. Gerald brings food. Kira comes when she can. Sometimes they sit on the porch after the meal and Gerald talks about Patricia, about things Maya has never heard before. Small memories he kept to himself for years because the grief of them was too specific and too tender to share in a house where Patricia's memory was not welcome. Maya listens to all of it. She thinks it is the most important thing her father has ever given her, the gift of those stories, the pieces of her mother she did not know she was missing until they arrived. It does not undo the years in the Collins house. It does not erase the empty drawer or the torn sleeve or the 9 minutes at the embassy. But it is real and it is honest, and it is the foundation of something new, which is the only kind of foundation worth building on. As for Diane and Kara, they are living quietly in a smaller city now, further from the life they built on someone else's sacrifice. The case concluded. The law did what the law is supposed to do when it is given sufficient documentation and sufficient resources. They are not homeless. They are not without any means. But the specific version of their life that rested on Maya's stolen foundation is gone, and what remains is smaller and more plainly theirs. Whether that plainness becomes the beginning of something honest is a choice that belongs to them alone, and Maya Collins has no interest in watching them make it. She has enough of her own life to tend to. More than enough now. There is a version of this story in which Maya Collins is a cautionary tale about what happens when you turn around for a stranger and the people who should protect you take advantage of the gap your goodness creates. That version of the story is real. It happened. Maya lived it for 5 years in shared apartments and pharmacy shifts, and the specific loneliness of rebuilding from a bag packed before noon on a February morning. But there is another version of this story, and it is the one that is true at the same time and in the same facts. It is the version in which a woman built from the right materials, built by a mother who held wrists and remembered names and asked how the day had gone before sitting down, walked out of a graduation ceremony on a Saturday in May with the highest clinical scores in her cohort and a handmade sign in the audience, and a father who finally, at last, had chosen his daughter over his own comfort. It is the version in which 11 seconds on a sidewalk, the 11 seconds Maya stood between going forward and turning around, produced 5 years of consequence that she survived and 1 morning of resolution that she had earned completely. The embassy gate closes. The drawer is empty. The shoes are on someone else's feet. And then, 5 years later, a girl looks up at you in a parking lot and says your name like it is the word she has been waiting to say since the morning you turned around. And a father who never stopped looking finds you in a waiting room and sets down the debt he has been carrying and says you saved my daughter, and you say I stayed with her until help came, and he says those are the same thing. And they are. They have always been the same thing. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Maya Collins, nurse. East side of Columbus, Ohio. First Sunday dinners with her father. Every other Saturday with Kira. A message from Sophie every October. A job in a community hospital where the patients need exactly the kind of nurse she has always been. The kind her mother taught her to be in a house on the east side of the city before either of them knew what it would cost and what it would eventually, gloriously, be worth. She turned around. Everything that followed came from that. And she would turn around again tomorrow. That is who Maya Collins is. That is who Patricia Collins raised. And that, if you have been listening to this story the way it deserves to be heard, is what makes it worth telling. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It means everything. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please leave a comment below and tell us what part hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do it now so you never miss a story like this one. We will see you in the next one.